Hello everyone, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 and welcome to another edition of the Flash Season 9 review series. And today I am going to be talking about Episode 5, The Mask of the Red Death Part 2, which I have just finished watching, and is a continuation from Episode 4, which was The Mask of the Red Death Part 1. And before I get into things, I just want to give a quick shout out to Arrowverse admin and fellow YouTuber William Linares, who kind of warned me to watch this episode at my very own peril. His words were, "Be afraid, be very afraid." So a quick shout out to him. And after just finished watching The Mask of the Red Death Part 2, well, this episode was 50-50, if I'm truly honest. There was some good points about this episode, but at the same time there was some clunkers in this episode, which I'll talk about as we move along here. As I said previously, I thought part 1 of The Mask of the Red Death, although it wasn't perfect, it was certainly pretty strong. Apart from a few clunkers, certainly the strongest of Season 9 thus far, especially compared to the previous 3 episodes. But as we got to Episode 5, which is Part 2 of The Mask of the Red Death, Part 1, pretty strong for the most part. Part 2, although it had some decent moments, I would say for the most part, this episode, unlike the previous one, pretty much went off the cliff, in my opinion, which I'll get into in a moment, because I was quite disappointed with the way the Red Death was handled as a character, because when they announced that for the final season of The Flash, they were going to be bringing in Red Death as essentially one of the main villains for the final season, I was very, very excited. And like all of you, I'm a hardcore geek. I know what Red Death is all about. He's a pretty big deal in the comic books, and we know that Red Death is essentially an evil version of Batman from an alternate timeline who killed Barry Allen, took his speed, and essentially helped kick off the Metal Wars. Now, obviously, I knew going in we were not going to be getting Bruce Wayne, because it just wasn't going to happen, which is fair enough. I've grown to accept the fact that we are not going to be getting Batman in the Arrowverse, even though we've had a couple of Bruce Wayne cameos already, but we were never ever going to see Bruce Wayne suited up as Batman, which is fine. I've grown to accept that over the course of time. When they announced that Red Death was going to be Batwoman, which, as we all know, Batwoman is played by Javicia Leslie, and she was going to be appearing on the show as a villain, I thought, okay, this is different. Maybe this could work. You know, you have to give things a chance. And I like to give things the benefit of the doubt before I give my opinion. So I was willing to give this a chance. I was willing to bite. I was thoroughly disappointed, if I'm truly honest, because anybody who knows the Red Death character, the Red Death is essentially the boss of bosses when it comes to evil speedsters. You know, the Red Death isn't like Savitar, isn't like Zoom or the Reverse Flash. This is essentially a nightmare version of Batman from hell. So, yeah, wasn't happy with the execution of the Red Death for Season 9. Really disappointed. I didn't expect to see the Red Death play a huge role. I didn't expect the Red Death to be the main villain for the final season. But I just thought maybe for the first half, things could actually turn a corner. And I thought maybe, yeah, you bring the Red Death in, business will pick up. No, it didn't. Far from it. The dialogue was clunky. You know, the way, you know, Ryan Wilder, you know, came across as angry. It just felt more comedic than scary, which is a shame, really, because Javicia Leslie, she's a decent actress, you know, and I thought she was pretty decent as Batwoman, but I just don't think she plays the villain as good as she plays the hero. Maybe that's just down to the way the character was written, I don't know, but I just didn't think she was good at being the villain, unlike being the hero. And that's not knocking her. She's lovely. She's awesome. But yeah, she didn't really feel like a big threat, unlike Fawn or Zoom. You know, I still go back to Zoom in particular because Zoom was just an absolute monster. And I've said this before. Imagine Bane getting the Flash's speed and then fusing with the Venom symbiote. You would probably get something like Zoom. That's what he was like. He felt like a big deal. He was scary as hell. And yeah, I still say to this day that out of all of the villains we've had since the Flash started, Fawn, of course, is the main one. That's never going to change. Fawn's more of a battle of intellectual wits, which is cool. That works fine. Zoom is just pure brute force, and he's downright evil, fear incarnate. Say no more. I didn't get any of that with Red Death. Now, they were trying to go for the Zoom approach, but it just didn't work. I'm really sorry. It just didn't work at all. But what can you do? But mercifully, this story arc is over. And fingers crossed, we get Cobalt Blue, which I think we are definitely going to see him. Because I've seen a couple of pictures of Rick Cosnett on set in the full Cobalt Blue suit. So we are definitely going to be seeing him. Not sure what episode he'll appear, but one way or another, we are definitely getting Cobalt Blue, 100%. And I've said this in past videos, Cobalt Blue is somebody I've been wanting to see appear on the show since the very beginning, and fingers crossed they'll actually come through and deliver to the fullest for the character. So we'll just have to wait and see, really. But aside from all of that, watching this episode was a real chore. You know, this was a real chore, a real mission to get through, but mercifully it's over and we can just move on to the next episode. So I'm going to give a quick recap of what's happened so far, and then we're going to get straight into talking about episode 5. So, as we saw previously in part 1 of The Mask of the Red Death, we see Red Death kidnap and capture Barry Allen, and Barry learned that the Red Death's speed is artificial, and we also saw Mark double-cross Team Flash as he switched sides to help Red Death build a cosmic treadmill to return home to her own timeline. And Barry, of course, learned that the identity of Red Death was none other than Ryan Wilder. And then she forced Barry to run on the cosmic treadmill in hopes of powering it so she could return home, and threatened Barry that he will keep running until eventually he dies. And then we see Mark sabotage the treadmill, and we end up seeing him getting completely overwhelmed by Red Death's band of rogues, and we see Team Flash and his band of rogues leave Mark, and it appeared that Mark was actually killed by Red Death and her band of rogues. And then we see at the very end, Red Death vows to bring war to the Flash and all of Central City. And that was how we left part 1 of The Mask of the Red Death, which also helped set up part 2. So with that all said, let's not waste any more time. Let's get straight into it. Let's talk about Mask of the Red Death Part 2. So this episode pretty much picks up where we left off from the end of part 1, and we see there's a red lightning storm over Central City, and at the CCPD, Kramer gets a report that things are getting worse, while the police are strapped. However, she walks into her office and Murmur is sitting there in her chair. We then see Red Death and her rogues are there and take out all of the police and leaving only Kramer standing as she uses her meta powers. But however, Red Death is faster and puts meta cuffs on her to prevent her from using her powers. Red Death is confident she will get away with what she plans to do, and she says she will show Kramer what true justice looks like. At Star Labs, Allegra is upset that Mark was left behind, but the Rogue Squad is defending themselves and they realise that Red Death is coming after them next. But Barry doesn't really have his speed and they don't have a great plan. Iris has a plan to trace Ryan's feelings because she got to know her a little bit. Cecile starts to look for hate and thus finds Ryan. She manages to pinpoint exactly where she's at, but Ryan can sense Cecile and she also senses Mark. Cecile finds that Mark is alive and well and chained up at the Red Death's lair, so he wasn't killed off after all. Barry wants the Rogue Squad to go after Mark, but the Rogues don't want to do that. They want to use the element of surprise against Red Death while they still have the advantage. Keone says that if they won't go after Mark, she will, even though she has no powers. This, of course, is enough to convince the Rogue Squad. Cecile says she can feel her powers growing, but she's not in the best shape. Joe tells her to rest. She tells him to get some food, but picks up that he's not doing okay emotionally. At CCPD, the evil rogues are working on hacking the satellite system so that Red Death can upgrade herself. Red Death is giddy at being the judge, jury, and executioner as she sends her puppets out into the city to create essentially her own warped version of the police force. So we basically see like copies of herself all around Central City, preventing anyone from leaving or getting in. Chester goes to figure out what is getting Red Death the boost. Barry tries to talk Keone out of helping to rescue Mark and then goes off with Allegra and the Rogue Squad to do it. Hartley picks up Mark's heartbeat and they find him in pretty bad shape, and it turns out it was all a trap. Red Death shows up to take out the last of his speed so that he can't stop her, while her sentinels keep watch for her. She also tells Barry that he's responsible for all of this, and this is due to his greatest mistake, and takes him to that moment and how it led to her success. We see Grodd after the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and we see Grodd has lost his sentience and all of his tribesmen, so he took Ryan's offer and decided to join with her instead. At Star Labs, Barry and the Rogue Squad debrief. Hartley wants to shift to survival rather than defeating Red Death. They still don't have a plan. Barry says they will find another way, but the Rogues feel they lost already and they decide to leave. They want to go make their amends before they die, because that's what they think will happen. Keone feels helpless, but Iris gives her a pep talk and tells her she has a place and she will find her use. She ends up kissing Mark, and that is enough to wake him up. Joe comes to talk to Barry, and Joe also realises that he doesn't need to protect people anymore and that the team doesn't really need him. Barry says otherwise and says that Joe's greatest superpower is inspiring people, but Joe says that he is also Barry's power is seeing the good in people, and Barry needs to believe that the seeds he planted in others will grow. See, I've always said from the very beginning that Joe is the Jonathan Kent of the show, a guy who pretty much has been the glue throughout the show's entire run, keeping all of the youngsters in check, because without him as the father figure, I truly believe everyone would just go off the rails and just go their separate ways and nothing would get done. We then see Barry goes to find Grodd. He asks Grodd to help him save the world and appeals to Grodd and what he knows. It somehow works, and Grodd decides to help Flash and stops helping Red Death. Flash has his speed back and goes back to face Red Death. It turns out that Grodd gave Flash his speed after the last time they met, where he gave him a bit of his speed force, so Grodd was just merely returning the favour. We see the Flash and Red Death racing around Central City and going at it. However, when she gets the upper hand, the Rogue Squad shows up and fights her as well. And when they start to struggle, Ryan Wilder, the real one, shows up in her Batwoman costume, and it's essentially Ryan Wilder versus Ryan Wilder. As they fight, Flash takes Red Death's armor and they knock her out. Team Flash achieve the victory thanks to Batwoman, and they make a joke about Central City always being crazy. See, I thought the Flash versus Red Death fight was pretty good, but I kind of felt that Batwoman may have taken a bit of the spotlight away, because I really wanted this to be Speedster versus Speedster. Maybe Batwoman could have joined in the battle, which would have been fine. I think that would have been okay, but I think ultimately this should have been Barry's moments. Just kind of felt like this was taken away from him a bit. And, going back to what I said before, Barry Allen is essentially taking a backseat to his own show. And especially this is supposed to be the final season. Just think maybe this should have been Barry's moments, not Batwoman's. I get they wanted to wrap up Batwoman's story. They could have still done that. But I think really should have been Barry's moments. So this was a good moment, but at the same time there were a couple of issues with it. But that's just me. At Star Labs, we see Chester fangirls about Batwoman. Argus has Red Death in custody, and Barry explains how he got his speed back and assures Ryan that her secret identity is safe and that everyone at Argus knows that Ryan Wilder is from another timeline. Barry explains that Grodd is a good guy again, and Star is helping to find his tribe and all of the people missing from Gorilla City. Ryan goes back to Gotham. Cecile and Joe sit down to talk, and Joe realises that being a parent is the most meaningful thing he can do. He decides that he and Jenna need to move while Cecile stays in Central City and just come visit them on the weekends so they can have quality time away from the craziness in Central City. This plan works for her just fine. We see a farewell party for Joe West. Joe gives an emotional speech. Mark goes to sit by himself, and Barry talks to him, reminding him he's now family. Allegra tries to talk to Chester and admits it was the best kiss she's ever had, so he kisses her again and everyone watches them. And they're now official. Iris gets dizzy and sits down and is confused as to why. And Keone tells her that she's pregnant, much to the surprise and delight of everyone. And that's how we end episode 5. Overall, this episode, as I mentioned, very 50-50. I thought part 1 was a lot stronger, and although part 2 did have some pretty decent moments, I think ultimately part 2 just kind of went off the cliff, really, and I was very disappointed with the way Red Death was handled, because, like I said, Red Death is essentially the boss of bosses as far as evil speedsters are concerned, and I just felt the whole execution was just very clunky. And, Javicia Leslie, a good, decent, solid actress. I just don't think she can play a villain as good as she can play a hero, because some of her outbursts where she gets angry just kind of came across as comedic, but not in a good way. And although it was cool to see Batwoman return and help save the day, I couldn't help but feel that this kind of took Barry's moment away. This should have been Red Death versus the Flash, which was, for the most part, a pretty decent fight, but kind of felt that Barry Allen once again was taking a backseat to his own show, which I've said from the beginning I've had a lot of issues with. And, yes, Batwoman helps out, but ultimately this should have been Barry's fight. And, I was really disappointed with that. I get what they were trying to do. As I said already, that they were wanting to try and resolve the Batwoman story, because, of course, as we know, Batwoman was cancelled after 3 seasons. But at the same time, this should have still been Barry's moment, overcoming the nightmare speedster and ultimately saving the day. And yeah, I was really disappointed with that. But, it was cool to see Red Death appear in the Arrowverse. At least we can say that now, but the execution was just not there, unfortunately. Fingers crossed they'll deliver with Cobalt's Blue. I'm really hoping for that. But as I said, by and large, this was a very 50-50 episode. Half decent, but half not so decent, but ultimately not decent at all. So we'll see, really. So that's going to be it from me. I am going to wrap this up now. What was your thoughts on episode 5? Did you enjoy it? Do you think it was better than part 1? Or do you think part 1 was better and you think part 2 was a letdown? What was your thoughts on Batwoman returning? Do you agree with what I said? Do you think that should have been the Flash's moment? And do you think maybe they just kind of took it away from him? And also, with the revelation that Iris is now pregnant, what does this mean for the future? Where do you think the future's heading? And also, where do Team Flash go from here? What's their next thing they're going to do? You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I will see all of you next time for another edition of the Flash Season 9 review series, where I am going to be talking about episode 6, which I'm hoping is going to be a lot better than this one, and they actually come through with something really good. So fingers crossed for that, and hopefully it should be a good one. So until next time, take care, everybody, and stay safe. And once again, as always, much appreciated. Thanks for listening.